Hello, welcome to the Echoes of Shadows channel. Have you ever heard stories from those who work in hospitals at night? Get ready to hear 4 chilling tales from employees who experienced the unexplainable. What happens in the empty halls and rooms when everyone is asleep? Make sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on more dark and chilling stories. Thank you. Story 1. The Last Shift.
I'm Richard, 34 years old, a nursing technician for over 6 years at St. Mary's Hospital here in San Jose, California. Working the night shift has never been a problem for me. The quiet, empty corridors always felt more peaceful than scary, or at least that's how it used to be, until that night. It was a Thursday during my overnight shift. The hospital was relatively quiet, but in my mind, life was chaotic. My young daughter, Lily, had been sick for a few days, and my wife, Emily, and I hadn't been able to sleep well. Exhaustion had become my daily routine, and that night it felt heavier than ever. On my shift, I worked in the palliative care ward on the 3rd floor. The patients there didn't have much hope for recovery. Among them was Mr. Johnson, a man in his 70s who had been battling a terminal illness for weeks. He was quiet, but in the last few days he had started saying strange things. "Do you hear them too?" he asked me as I adjusted his pillows that night. At first I thought it was just delirium. Mr. Johnson had been having rough nights, full of pain and suffering. It wasn't uncommon for terminal patients to say things that didn't make sense. But that night, the way he said it, it made me uncomfortable. "Who, Mr. Johnson?" I asked, more out of politeness than curiosity. "Those people, the ones who walk the halls at night. They won't let me sleep," he replied with a blank stare. A chill ran down my spine, but I brushed it off, did my job, and wished him a good night. The shift went on like any other. Me, Jessica, the head nurse, and 2 other techs took turns checking on the patients. Around 2 a.m., I got a call on the radio asking me to grab a stretcher from the 4th floor in the hospital's closed-off wing. I had been up there before, but that night, the thought of climbing those stairs bothered me. The 4th floor was an eerie place even during the day. It was an old wing, renovated and closed off years ago. Most of the rooms were locked, and we only used that area as storage for old equipment and spare beds. The elevator worked, but that night I decided to take the stairs. The elevator's creaky noise always unnerved me more. I climbed the stairs slowly, the sound of my footsteps echoing off the empty steps. When I reached the top, the hallway was dark, with just a few flickering lights in the distance. I felt a tightness in my chest, a sense that I wasn't alone. Nonsense, I thought. I'm just tired. I grabbed the stretcher, started heading back, but halfway down the hall, I heard something. A whisper, as if someone was softly saying my name. I froze. I turned around and all I saw was the shadow of a partially open door. For a split second, I thought I saw something move inside the room. Mr. Johnson and his people, I remembered. I pretended I didn't see anything, hurried down with the stretcher, trying to shake off the feeling of being watched. When I got back to the 3rd floor, something was wrong. Jessica and the other techs were talking quietly, looking anxious. "What's going on?" I asked. Jessica looked at me worried. "Mr. Johnson, he passed away," she said, her voice low. I glanced at the clock. It was almost 2:30 a.m. My stomach churned. Less than an hour ago, I had been talking to him. How? My brain tried to process it. I had just seen Mr. Johnson. I spoke to him. He was alive, talking about those people. With trembling hands, I went back to Mr. Johnson's room. There he was, lying still. There was no way he could have gotten out of bed. The heart monitor was flatlined. His heartbeat had stopped long before. Still trying to make sense of everything, a cold chill washed over me. Something was wrong, and the feeling wouldn't go away. I needed a moment to breathe, to clear my head. I decided to go back up to the 4th floor, just to check. When I got there, in the middle of the dark hallway, my heart nearly stopped. Mr. Johnson was there, standing, in the same spot where I had seen something earlier. He was staring at one of the open doors, as if waiting for something. My body froze. How could he be there if I had just seen him dead in his bed? I ran as fast as I could, not daring to look back. I rushed back to the 3rd floor, shaking and drenched in sweat. I didn't tell anyone, because who would believe me? But after that night, I never went up to the fourth floor alone again. I knew that somehow Mr. Johnson was still up there, or at least part of him was. And every time I hear a whisper in the halls at night, I wonder, is he back, walking the corridors like the people he used to talk about?
Story 2. The last encounter in the hallway.
I'm not someone who usually believes in the supernatural. I've always preferred to rely on what I can see, touch, and most importantly, understand. My name is Richard, and I've been a surgeon for nearly 10 years. This profession has always given me a sense of control. Every cut, every stitch, every procedure, everything follows logic and reason. But one night in a hospital in Bellingham, Washington, I experienced something that I still can't fully explain. It was a routine Wednesday, nothing out of the ordinary. I had a surgery scheduled for a young man named Michael, 26 years old. He had acute appendicitis and needed an operation as soon as possible to avoid complications. The surgery was straightforward, with no major issues. My team and I worked efficiently, and within an hour the appendix was out. Michael was expected to recover well, with no further concerns. After the operation, I left him in the recovery room and went on to check my other patients. The hospital that night was quieter than usual, which allowed me to finish early. I was tired but content with the outcome of the surgery. I was about to head home when, around 11 p.m., I felt the urge to walk through the hospital one more time. I can't explain why, but something drew me to the recovery area. As I walked through one of the hallways near the ICU, I saw him. Michael was standing there, slowly walking down the hall, glancing around like he was a bit lost. At first, I felt relieved. Great, he's already up on his feet, I thought. I approached, ready to ask how he was feeling, but something about the way he moved made me uneasy. There was something off, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. Michael, I called. He stopped but didn't turn to face me. He just stood there, his back to me, completely still. My head started spinning. Something was very wrong. I knew he should still be in recovery, likely under the effects of the anesthesia. How could he be walking so soon? The hallway was nearly empty, and the cold hospital lights seemed even dimmer at that moment. I took a few more steps toward him when one of the nurses, Casey, rushed down the hall from the opposite direction. She was pale and out of breath. "Doctor, Michael," she gasped, barely able to speak. "He just passed away. We had a sudden complication in recovery. We tried everything, but we couldn't revive him." The ground felt like it was giving way beneath me. I looked at the nurse, stunned, and then back to the hallway where Michael had been. But he was gone. The hallway was empty, as if he had never been there. In that moment, a chill ran down my spine, a sensation I had never felt before. My mind was scrambling for a rational explanation. Maybe the exhaustion had caused me to see things. Maybe I had mistaken someone else for Michael. But deep down, I knew what I had seen. I rushed to the recovery room where Michael's body lay. The nurse filled me in on the details. He had suffered a sudden cardiac arrest just minutes earlier, and despite their best efforts, they couldn't bring him back. The surgery had been a success, but for reasons beyond our control, his heart simply stopped a few hours later. I stared at his lifeless body, trying to process everything. What had I seen in that hallway? Was it him? Or was I losing my mind? I left the room in silence, with a growing sense that something was terribly wrong. As I walked back through the same hallway where I had seen Michael, I noticed something on the floor that made me stop in my tracks. There near the wall was a hospital bracelet. It was Michael's bracelet, with his name and details, the one he had worn during surgery. There was no doubt in my mind. That was his bracelet, and it should have still been on his wrist. I picked it up, my hands shaking slightly, trying to make sense of how it ended up there. This confirmed what I had feared. What I saw was real. Michael had appeared to me for reasons I'll never understand. Since that day, I've never been the same. I continue my work as usual, but that experience stays with me. The science I've relied on all my life doesn't offer any answers for what happened that night. I still walk down that hallway almost every day, but I avoid looking at the spot where I last saw Michael. And every time I think back to that night, I feel the same cold chill, the same fear that if I look again, he'll be there, watching me in silence. I don't know what you make of all this. Frankly, I don't know what to believe anymore. But what I do know is that on that night, I saw something that I still can't explain. Something that goes beyond everything medicine has taught me. And sometimes I wonder, was that encounter just the beginning of something far greater that is yet to unfold?
Story 3. The Last Heartbeat.
My name is Helena Jones, and I'm going to tell you something that happened to me, something I'll never forget. I was born and raised in Greenville, South Carolina, and I've been working as a cleaner at St. Luke's Hospital for 5 years now. After my husband died in a car accident, I was left to raise 3 kids on my own, and this job was my lifeline. It's not easy work, but I'm grateful to have it. The night shift was the only slot available, and if I could, I'd switch it. There's something eerie about hospitals at night. It's not a peaceful quiet, but a silence that feels heavy, like it's carrying the weight of all the sadness and suffering in the building. The ICU, where I spend most of my time cleaning, is the worst. It's like the air there is thicker, weighed down by the memories of people who never made it out alive. I don't usually talk about this, because people would think I'm just tired or making things up. But after that night, I know it wasn't just my imagination. It was a Tuesday, one I'll never forget. The air had that typical fall chill, not cold enough to shiver, but enough to make you uncomfortable. As usual, I grabbed my mop and headed up to the 3rd floor, where the ICU rooms were. Room 303 had just been vacated earlier that afternoon. The patient, Mr. Parker, had passed away. Another one. I've seen so many go since I started working there. Normally, it's routine. Get in, change the sheets, mop the floors, and leave. But that night, it was different. As soon as I stepped into the room, a shiver ran down my spine. Not from the cold, but the kind of chill you get when you feel like something is off. I tried to shake it off, too tired to let it get to me. I started changing the sheets on Mr. Parker's bed, and as I was just about done, I saw something out of the corner of my eye. The sheet moved, just a little, but enough to catch my attention. I brushed it off, thinking it was nothing, but then the heart monitor started beeping. I froze. That machine wasn't supposed to be on. No one was connected to it. Mr. Parker was gone, and the room was empty. But the sound of the heart monitor echoed through the room, beeping as if it were tracking a heartbeat, slow and steady, like someone was still lying in that bed. I tried to convince myself it was just a malfunction, but every instinct in my body told me something else was going on. Fear started creeping in. I took a deep breath and tried to calm down, convincing myself I was just overworked. People see strange things when they're tired, right? But then I took a closer look at the monitor, and what I saw made my blood run cold. The name on the screen wasn't Mr. Parker's. It was someone else, Mr. James, a patient who had passed away a few weeks earlier. My legs felt like they were going to give out, but I needed to make sure I wasn't imagining things. I ran to the nurse's station and found Celine, the nurse who worked with me on the night shift. Celine had been there for years, and I trusted her more than anyone in that hospital. I explained what was happening, and she gave me a strange look, like she already knew something. "I've heard stories about that room, Helena," she said, her voice low, as if afraid someone else might hear. We walked back to room 303 together. As soon as Celine saw the monitor flashing Mr. James's name, her face went pale. "That man, he used to say strange things before he passed," she whispered, her voice trembling. "He kept saying he wasn't alone, and that even after death, he would come back to reclaim what was his." Every word she spoke sent a chill down my spine. Then she dropped another bombshell. Mr. James had lived in the same neighborhood as me. People in the area knew him as an odd man, someone with dark secrets. At that moment, everything started to make sense, though I didn't want to believe it. It felt like this spirit, or whatever it was, had come back for something, or someone. And I had a sinking feeling that it was connected to me somehow. After all, he lived near me. Was he trying to send a message, or worse, come after me or my children? In the days that followed, the strange occurrences didn't stop. Other cleaners began to talk about hearing odd noises, footsteps, doors closing by themselves, and whispers coming from that same room. The hospital tried to keep it quiet, but everyone who worked there knew something was wrong with room 303. I couldn't take it anymore. I asked to be transferred to a different shift because the thought of being in that hospital at night terrified me. But even after I left, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, waiting. I still pass St. Luke's every now and then, and every time I do, I feel that same cold fear creeping up my spine. And that heart monitor beep? It still echoes in my mind, as clear as it was that night. I don't know if Mr. James got what he came for, or if he's still out there waiting. But one thing's for sure, he left a piece of himself in that room, and I'll never forget it.
Story 4. The Rocking Chair.
My name is Michael, I'm 30 years old, and I've been working as a nurse for about 7 years. I'm used to long night shifts, deep silence, and that feeling that time just doesn't pass. You know, after a while, the hospital at night feels like a repetitive routine. But on the night I'm about to tell you about, something happened that completely changed the way I see night shifts. It's the kind of thing that makes you question what's real and what's just in your head. It was a typical night, the kind where the hospital seemed to be asleep. It was almost 2 a.m. I was alone in the hallway of Ward C, making my rounds to check on the patients. At that moment, everyone was stable. As usual, the hospital was quiet, the low hum of the air conditioning and the occasional beep of the monitors breaking the silence. I had already checked a few rooms, and as I approached room 14, I felt a shift in the air. A sudden chill crept up my spine, the kind of chill that doesn't match the warm, muggy nights of Houston, Texas. Room 14 had been empty for a few days. The patient who had occupied it had been discharged, and since then, no one had been admitted there. Hospitals have routines, and when a room is empty, the bed is made. Everything looks neat and orderly. Nothing strange about that. But that night, something felt off. As I walked by the door, I heard a faint sound, almost like something was being dragged across the floor. I stopped immediately and tried to listen more carefully. It could have been another nurse, maybe a patient shifting in bed. Anything, I thought. But the more I listened, the clearer it became that the sound was coming from inside room 14. A shiver ran down my back. For a moment, I considered ignoring it and moving on. But something pulled me back, like a force beyond my control. A morbid curiosity I couldn't resist. I walked up to the door and looked inside the room. At first, I didn't see anything out of the ordinary. Just the empty bed, the soft light illuminating the space, the furniture in its usual place. But then, my eyes fixed on the chair beside the bed. It was gently rocking, on its own. Not a strong movement, but slow, almost methodical, as if someone had just stood up and left it rocking back and forth. I froze, unable to believe what I was seeing. My heart raced, and a fear like I'd never felt before took hold of me. The chair continued its movement, as if pushed by invisible hands. There was no one in the room, no breeze, nothing that could explain it. I tried to find a logical explanation. Maybe the floor was uneven? Maybe there had been a small tremor? No, this wasn't normal. For a few seconds, I was completely paralyzed. The sound of the chair creaking echoed in the empty room, growing louder in my head. I couldn't take my eyes off it, yet at the same time, I wanted to run. Instead, I stepped into the room. My feet felt heavy, and each breath seemed to get harder, as if the air had become thicker. The chair continued to rock, and the cold running through my body only intensified. When I got closer, the chair stopped moving. The sudden silence was even worse. It was as if something was watching me, waiting for me to react. My hands were sweaty, and I tried to control my breathing, but the air still felt thick, hard to draw in. I stood there for a few more seconds, staring at the chair, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I thought about calling someone, but I felt ridiculous. How could I explain this? The chair was moving on its own? No one would believe me. I wouldn't have believed it myself if I hadn't seen it. But I knew what I saw, and I couldn't shake the feeling that there was someone in that room. It wasn't visible, but it was there. The room felt alive in a way I had never noticed before. I looked around, examining every detail, searching for anything out of place. But besides the chair, everything was where it should be. The room looked just like any other, yet the unease lingered. The air still felt thick, like I was being watched. I decided to leave, but before I closed the door, I glanced back into the room. The chair was still now, unmoving, as if nothing had ever happened. But I knew what I saw, and I couldn't get the image out of my head. I walked back into the hallway, trying to shake off the strange feeling that had taken over me. I continued with my rounds, but something inside me had changed. From that moment on, every sound, every shadow felt different. The hospital, once just a place of work, now had something unsettling about it, something I couldn't quite explain. I tried to go about my shift as usual, but the image of that chair moving on its own kept replaying in my mind. A few hours later, as morning approached, my shift finally ended, and I went home. The exhaustion I felt wasn't just physical, but mental. I spent the day trying to come up with a logical explanation, but nothing made sense. I thought about telling a friend, another nurse, but I gave up. How could I explain it without sounding like I'd lost my mind? For weeks after, I avoided room 14. Every time I had to make my rounds, I took a different route, steering clear of that room. I didn't talk to anyone about what happened, not even my coworkers. I kept it inside, like a secret I didn't want to share. And every night shift, the fear that it might happen again lingered in the back of my mind. Now, every time I walk through the hospital at night, I feel like there's something more there. Something we can't see, but that's present. Maybe I'll never know what happened that night, and maybe it's better that way. After all, some things don't need an explanation. Some things just happen. And I've learned not to question what my eyes see in the long, lonely hours of the night.